Hey guys, tonight we dive headfirst into the dust, sweat, and clang of medieval battlefields, where the emperor's army and the armies of the Roman princes clash not just swords, but ideas, power, and survival. You are there, feeling the ground shake beneath marching feet, the smell of leather, iron, and fire mixing in the air. It's a world where loyalty is tested and banners flutter like desperate hopes. But beware, you probably won't survive this without a few bruises, if not a dented ego. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time below. I'm curious who's joining from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start with the Emperor's army, vast, complex, and designed to project imperial power across a fragmented realm. Unlike a national army, it was a patchwork of levies, professional soldiers, and feudal contingents summoned from diverse regions. The emperor's forces were meant to enforce law, defend borders, and suppress internal rebellions. Picture banners with the imperial eagle, soldiers arrayed in a mix of armor styles, and commanders juggling political rivalries as much as military strategy. The emperor's army was commanded by high-ranking nobles or appointed generals, often balancing personal ambitions with loyalty. Despite its name, it wasn't a monolithic force but a coalition, where unity was hard-won and discipline varied. A quirky fact, imperial armies sometimes included exotic units, like Italian crossbowmen famed for their deadly accuracy, or mercenary groups clad in flamboyant colors that made them look like walking rainbows, surely confusing the enemy more than intimidating them. Historians still argue whether the emperor's army was truly effective or hampered by the empire's decentralized nature. Some emphasize its symbolic power and strategic successes. Others highlight logistical nightmares and internal discord. So, as you step into the boots of a soldier in this vast but unruly force, you feel the tension between unity and chaos, power and fragility, a theme that will echo through our entire journey. Remember that uneasy loyalty we talked about. It's already front and center in the emperor's army. You shift your focus and step into the realm of the medieval Roman princes, each raising their own armies like miniature kings, defending their patch of the empire. These princely forces were more localized, reflecting the patchwork nature of medieval political power. Unlike the emperor's broader coalition, princes' armies were tightly tied to their own territories, woven from vassals, mercenaries, and local levies who owed personal allegiance. Picture the banners of a prince, a mix of heraldic colors and symbols representing family, land, and pride waving over fortified castles. The heart of their military and political power. Their armies were often smaller but fiercely loyal, reflecting the close-knit bonds of feudal society. Command structures here were more personal. Princes led or appointed trusted nobles, sometimes relatives, to command their troops, blending family loyalty with military strategy. Their forces could be quickly mobilized for regional conflicts or to assert autonomy from imperial control. A quirky detail, some princes maintained elite household troops who doubled as personal bodyguards and shock troops. Imagine a medieval version of the Secret Service, clad in distinctive armor and carrying ornate weapons that made them stand out on the battlefield. Historians still debate whether princes' armies were more effective on the battlefield due to tighter control and local knowledge, or whether their limited size and resources put them at a disadvantage compared to the emperor's broader forces. Economically, Princes funded their armies through local taxes, tolls, and control over trade routes, often leading to conflicts with neighboring lords and the emperor alike. As you walk through their camps, you sense the pride and fierce independence fueling these armies, a blend of family honor, political ambition, and the raw realities of medieval warfare. Remember those colorful mercenaries in the emperor's army? Princes often hired similar troops, blurring the lines between loyalty and mercenary pragmatism. You trace the tangled roots where these two military traditions, the emperor's army and the prince's forces, began and diverged. The emperor's army grew out of a desire to unify a sprawling, fragmented realm under a central authority, inheriting vestiges of Roman legions mingled with feudal levies. The prince's armies, on the other hand, evolved from localized power centers, where territorial lords maintained personal forces to defend autonomy and assert influence. Early on, both drew from a similar pool-armored horsemen, foot soldiers, and levy peasants. But their purposes quickly diverged. The emperor's forces sought to project imperial authority broadly, responding to internal revolts or external threats, while princes marshaled their troops primarily for regional defense or political maneuvering. A quirky historical tidbit. Some early imperial campaigns involved armies that looked more like wandering bands of mercenaries and feudal knights than organized forces, leading to chaotic battles and shifting alliances on the fly, like a medieval reality television show. Minus the cameras. Historians still argue whether the emperor's army or the prince's forces were more authentic representations of medieval military power. Some emphasize the symbolic nature of the imperial army as a unifying ideal, while others focus on the practical effectiveness and loyalty embedded in princely armies. Over time, these differing origins created distinct military cultures. Imperial troops often faced challenges in cohesion and logistics due to their diverse origins, while princely armies benefited from tighter social bonds but struggled with limited manpower. As you delve deeper, you realize these armies aren't just fighting forces, they're reflections of political and social realities, shaped by history as much as by strategy. Remember those banners fluttering over castles and imperial fields? Each tells a story of origin, ambition, and identity. You peer into the chain of command that held together these two distinct forces, noticing how leadership shaped the fortunes of armies and empires alike. The emperor's army was led by a complex hierarchy of imperial generals, appointed by the emperor or high-ranking nobles, often juggling personal ambitions and political loyalties. Command was sometimes divided, leading to coordination challenges but also balancing power among factions. In contrast, the prince's armies featured more centralized leadership, typically commanded by the prince himself or trusted relatives. The smaller scale and tighter social fabric allowed for swift decision-making and clearer authority, though sometimes at the cost of broader strategic vision. A quirky detail: some commanders in the emperor's army carried ornate staffs, topped with eagles or lions, symbols of authority, and sometimes fashionable distractions that could get in the way during battle. Imagine a general accidentally poking his own eye with a ceremonial scepter mid-campaign. Historians still debate whether the emperor's layered command structure was a strength, allowing for checks and balances, or a weakness that hampered battlefield effectiveness. Meanwhile, princely armies' simpler hierarchy often fostered loyalty but could suffer from nepotism or impulsiveness. Military councils and war councils were common in the imperial army, where generals, nobles, and advisors debated tactics, sometimes to the frustration of field commanders. Princes often relied more on personal judgment, sometimes leading to bold gambles or costly mistakes. As you listen to the echoes of shouted orders and whispered intrigues, you see leadership not as a fixed role, but a dynamic force shaping the fates of men and nations. Remember those colorful mercenaries and secretive household troops? Their commanders often played politics as fiercely as they fought. You walk alongside the dusty roads, leading to mustering grounds where soldiers for both the emperor and the princes gather, recruited through vastly different means that reveal much about medieval society. The emperor's army raised troops through a patchwork of feudal levies, royal summons, and contracts with mercenaries, reflecting the empire's sprawling and fragmented nature. In contrast, princes relied heavily on personal vassals, local levies, and sometimes paid soldiers, maintaining forces more tightly bound by loyalty or regional obligation. For the emperor, recruitment was a logistical puzzle, calling on nobles across distant lands to fulfill their military obligations, often with delays, reluctance, or substitution by mercenary hirelings. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where pieces sometimes refused to fit neatly, leading to inconsistent troop quality and timing. A quirky tidbit: in some cases, nobles sent substitutes or paid fines to avoid personal service, a practice known as scutage, which sometimes led to armies filled with hired swords rather than loyal vassals. Think of it as medieval outsourcing. With mixed results, historians still debate the effectiveness of feudal levies versus professional soldiers. Some argue feudal levies lacked discipline and commitment, while others emphasize their importance in maintaining social bonds and local defense. Princes' recruitment was often more straightforward but limited by the size of their domains. Their forces included sworn retainers and peasants compelled by feudal duties, sometimes supplemented by mercenaries for specialized roles. You can almost hear the clamor of peasants being called to arms, the contracts signed by mercenaries, and the proud declarations of nobles rallying their banners. This patchwork recruitment shaped not only the size but the quality, loyalty, and readiness of each army foundations on which their fates would turn. Remember those colorful mercenaries in both armies. They were often the glue holding uneven forces together. You step onto the battlefield and feel the thrum of diverse troops arrayed under two banners: the emperor's vast, mixed army and the tightly knit forces of the princes. The composition of these armies reveals contrasting military cultures. Both foot soldiers and cavalry played key roles, but their proportions and functions varied. The emperor's army relied heavily on cavalry, knightly horsemen raised from imperial knights and nobles, providing shock troops capable of decisive charges. Infantry, often levied peasants or city militias, formed the bulk but sometimes lacked the training and discipline of their mounted comrades. The combination was a delicate balance, aiming to harness the mobility of cavalry with the holding power of infantry. Princes' armies, while smaller, often boasted more cohesive units. Their infantry included well-trained household troops and local levies familiar with the terrain. Cavalry was equally important, but sometimes less numerous, compensated by the intimate loyalty and coordination within these forces. A quirky fact: some armies used units called landsknechts, mercenary pikemen known for flamboyant clothing and a love of loud, boisterous behavior. These colorful foot soldiers could disrupt heavy cavalry charges with disciplined pike formations, a medieval version of a dance troupe in armor. Historians still argue whether the emperor's reliance on a large but sometimes unruly force was more effective than the prince's smaller, tighter-knit armies. While sheer numbers could overwhelm, cohesion and morale often determined outcomes. Weapons and armor reflected these differences. Imperial cavalry sported heavy plate armor and lances, while infantry wielded a mix of spears, swords, and early firearms. Prince's troops adapted to local conditions, sometimes favoring lighter armor and flexible tactics. As you watch the interplay of foot and horse, you realize these armies were ecosystems, each part vital to the whole, shaped by history, politics, and geography. Remember those colorful mercenaries, their pikes and polearms changed the rules of cavalry dominance forever. You step onto the training grounds where discipline is hammered out alongside steel, contrasting the preparation of the emperor's sprawling forces and the prince's compact armies. The imperial army's size made standardized training a challenge. Soldiers often arrived with varying skills and equipment, requiring patchwork drills and leadership to forge cohesion. Many troops were seasonal levies, called up briefly and expected to perform despite limited preparation. Prince's armies, smaller and more tightly knit, could train year-round. Their soldiers, often household retainers or loyal vassals, drilled regularly in formations, weapon handling, and battlefield maneuvers. The camaraderie and constant practice created units that moved and fought as one, compensating for their smaller numbers with discipline. A quirky tidbit: some imperial soldiers reportedly learned battlefield commands through a series of musical signals, drums, horns, and even yodels designed to cut through the chaos, but sometimes causing confusion when misheard, especially on windy days. Historians still argue whether discipline or sheer numbers mattered more in medieval battles. The emperor's forces could overwhelm opponents, but poor coordination sometimes led to disastrous retreats. Prince's troops excelled in tactical execution, but risked being outnumbered. Officers in both armies often came from the nobility. With varying degrees of military knowledge, the emperor's generals sometimes faced criticism for prioritizing politics over strategy, while Prince commanders enjoyed more direct control but less strategic depth. Training also included siegecraft, archery, and the use of early gunpowder weapons, reflecting the evolving nature of warfare. So, as you observe soldiers marching, drilling, and sparring, you see how preparation shaped the fighting spirit and effectiveness of these contrasting armies. Remember those colorful mercenaries? They often brought their own training methods, adding flair and unpredictability to the mix. You tighten your grip on a well-worn sword and survey the varied armament and equipment that outfitted the emperor's army and the prince's forces. In the sprawling imperial army, diversity reigned. Soldiers arrived, bearing everything from simple spears and chainmail to gleaming plate armor and ornate lances. The disparity reflected the decentralized nature of recruitment. Wealthier knights and nobles brought their best gear, while levied, peasants often made do with farm tools or basic weapons. Princes' armies tended to be more uniform, outfitting their troops with standardized equipment whenever possible. Household guards and retainers received better armor and weapons, sometimes funded directly from princely coffers, reflecting tighter control and pride in their forces. A quirky fact: some imperial mercenaries famously decorated their helmets with feathers, horns, or even stuffed birds to intimidate foes, or perhaps just to stand out in the fog of war. One unit was nicknamed the Peacock Brigade for their flamboyant headgear. Historians still argue how much equipment disparity affected battlefield outcomes. While superior armor and weapons offered advantages, mobility and tactics often proved decisive. Overly heavy armor could slow soldiers, making them vulnerable. Weaponry included swords, axes, maces, bows, crossbows, and early firearms. The emperor's army relied heavily on heavy cavalry's lance and sword, while infantry used spears and bows for defense and ranged attacks. Prince's troops often adapted weapons to local conditions, With some regions favoring polearms or mounted archers, logistics played a crucial role. Armies needed to maintain supplies of arms and armor, requiring skilled blacksmiths, armorers, and transport systems. As you tighten your gauntlet, you feel the tangible differences in gear, an extension of each army's character, resources, and strategy. Remember those colorful mercenaries. Their eclectic equipment was both a strength and a source of chaos on the field. You stand on the rolling fields where the emperor's vast army and the prince's forces face off, each employing distinctive tactical doctrines shaped by their composition and leadership. The emperor's army, with its mix of cavalry, infantry, and mercenaries, favored broad maneuver, using heavy cavalry charges to break enemy lines while supporting infantry held positions or skirmished. Prince's armies, often smaller and more cohesive, excelled in flexible tactics, ambushes, terrain exploitation, and rapid flanking maneuvers. Their commanders relied on intimate knowledge of local geography and personal leadership to outmaneuver larger forces. A quirky fact, some commanders employed war beasts, like war dogs, or even early attempts at using elephants or camels. To disrupt enemy formations, imagine the confusion when your orderly ranks are suddenly charged by barking armored dogs. Historians still debate how much tactical innovation existed in medieval armies versus reliance on brute force and tradition. The emperor's larger forces struggled with coordination, sometimes falling prey to smaller, agile princely armies. Siege tactics were another area where differences emerged. The emperor's forces often had access to advanced siege engines and engineers, reflecting greater resources, while princes improvised or relied on guerrilla tactics to harass enemy fortifications. Communication during battles was limited to runners, horns, and banners, making command and control a constant challenge. As you watch knights and foot soldiers maneuvering, you appreciate the evolving art of war, a blend of tradition, innovation, and the unpredictable fog of battle. Remember those musical battlefield signals? Miscommunication could turn a clever tactic into a chaotic retreat. You find yourself beside massive stone walls, observing the slow grind of siege warfare as the emperor's army and the prince's forces bring their might to bear on fortified castles and cities. Siege warfare was a brutal and complex art, combining engineering, patience, and psychological warfare, essential for medieval campaigns where strongholds dictated control. The emperor's army, often larger and better funded, deployed heavy siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, and battering rams alongside engineers skilled in undermining walls or building siege towers. Their prolonged campaigns aimed to starve defenders or breach defenses with overwhelming force. Princes' armies, constrained by resources and manpower, sometimes relied on trickery, negotiations, or quick assaults on weaker points. Their knowledge of local terrain could provide advantages in siege tactics, such as cutting off supply lines or launching surprise sorties. A quirky detail, some sieges featured bizarre psychological tactics, fake retreats to lure defenders out, or spreading rumors that the enemy had magical protections, aiming to demoralize troops. Historians still debate how decisive siege warfare was compared to open battle. While sieges could last months or years, draining resources and patience, the fall of a key fortress often turned the tide of a war. Sieges tested not just military might, but the resilience of defenders and attackers alike. Disease, famine, and morale played as much a role as trebuchet stones. As you watch the slow siege unfold, you understand it as a war of attrition. cunning, and endurance, where commanders balanced brutality with strategy. Remember those training drills and tactical debates all led to moments like these, where preparation met grim reality. You sense the tension rise as the emperor's army and the prince's forces scramble to mobilize, revealing stark contrasts in readiness and speed. The emperor's vast army, though impressive on paper, often faced delays. Coordinating levies from distant provinces was like herding cats scattered across an empire. Seasonal obligations, local disputes, and political wrangling could slow muster calls, leaving campaigns waiting on reluctant or late-arriving troops. Princes, with their smaller, localized forces, could often mobilize quickly. Their vassals and retainers lived nearby and answered the call promptly. This agility allowed princely armies to respond swiftly to threats or seize opportunities before imperial reinforcements arrived. A quirky tidbit. Some commanders resorted to creative means to expedite mobilization, sending jesters and musicians to rally troops, or even offering beer and food incentives to speed up muster. Imagine medieval recruiters armed with ale rather than threats. Historians still debate whether rapid mobilization outweighed the sheer size of forces. Quick action could surprise enemies, but smaller armies risked being overwhelmed if reinforcements failed to arrive. The emperor's army often relied on seasonal campaigning to fit agricultural cycles, limiting how long soldiers could be away. Princes had more flexibility but faced their own constraints. Communication across vast distances further complicated mobilization, with messages traveling slowly by horseback or courier. As you feel the clamor of troops assembling, if you understand that speed and coordination could mean victory or disaster long before swords clashed, remember those patchwork recruitment puzzles. They set the stage for this frenetic race to the battlefield. You settle into the financial heart of the matter, where the survival of armies and empires depends on coins, levies, and clever accounting. The emperor's army was an expensive beast to feed, arm, and mobilize. Funding came from imperial taxes, tributes, and, often, the reluctant pockets of local nobles. This patchwork financing reflected the empire's decentralized nature, with money trickling in unevenly and sometimes late, complicating logistics and morale. Princes financed their armies through local taxation, tolls, control of trade routes, and their own estate's revenues. Their smaller scale allowed for more direct control, but also meant resources were limited and campaigns often constrained by finances. A quirky fact: some imperial officials kept detailed ledgers of soldier payments and supplies, but irregularities and corruption were common. There are tales of mercenaries paid in promises or IOUs, who promptly switched sides, classic medieval get-rich-quick schemes. Historians still debate the efficiency of these financing systems. While imperial armies had greater theoretical resources, the complexity and distance often led to shortages. Princes managed tighter budgets, but with more immediate control. Raising funds sometimes involved levying scutage payments in lieu of military service, which, while convenient, could reduce actual troop numbers and increase reliance on mercenaries. Economic pressures influenced not just army size, but equipment quality, training, and campaign duration. Financial crises could halt wars abruptly or force rapid retreats. As you flip through dusty account books and listen to merchants' grumbles, you realize war is as much about economics as valor. Remember those colorful mercenaries? Many were hired precisely because money talked louder than loyalty. You find yourself amid the swirling chaos of medieval battlefields, where the clashing steel of mercenaries punctuates the thunderous charge of knights and the disciplined ranks of infantry. Both the emperor's and the prince's armies relied heavily on mercenaries, soldiers of fortune who fought not for loyalty but for coin. These hired blades filled gaps left by unreliable levies or augmented forces for crucial campaigns. Mercenaries came in many flavors: hardened infantry, skilled crossbowmen, and fierce cavalry, often bringing their own weapons, armor, and tactics. Their flamboyant attire and distinctive fighting styles set them apart, sometimes boosting morale, other times causing friction with native troops. A quirky tidbit: some mercenary bands had their own unique customs and languages, making coordination tricky. One notorious group, known for their loud, boisterous behavior, earned the nickname the Wild Hounds, famed for both battlefield ferocity and post-battle revelry. Historians still debate mercenaries' impact, whether their professional skills outweighed loyalty issues and the risks of desertion or betrayal. Some argue mercenaries were essential to sustaining medieval warfare. Others caution they could destabilize armies and politics. Financing mercenaries was costly, sometimes consuming large portions of military budgets. Princes often relied on them more heavily due to limited vassal forces. While the emperor balanced mercenary use with feudal levies, mercenary commanders sometimes acted as power brokers, negotiating contracts and influencing campaign strategies. Their presence added unpredictability to medieval warfare. As you watch these hired swords swing their blades and fire crossbows, you sense a world where loyalty was bought, honor was fleeting, and survival was paramount. Remember those colorful mercenaries decorating their helmets. Their flair was as much a weapon as their swords. You step into the hearts and minds of the soldiers, wondering what drove their loyalty, the emperor or the prince. The emperor's army was a patchwork of allegiances, with many soldiers swearing fealty to local lords or mercenary captains rather than to the distant imperial throne. This diffuse loyalty sometimes led to divided focus or hesitation in battle. As soldiers juggled competing obligations, princess armies, on the other hand, were often forged from personal ties. Vassals, retainers, and locals bound by kinship or oath to their prince. This closeness fostered a sense of camaraderie and purpose, often translating into fiercer battlefield commitment. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers carried tokens or relics gifted by their lord as physical reminders of loyalty, much like medieval friendship bracelets with a deadly serious twist. One regiment was rumored to fight harder when their captain brandished a worn boot once belonging to the prince. Historians still debate how much ideology versus pragmatism motivated medieval soldiers. Were they truly loyal to abstract concepts like the empire, or merely serving immediate interests and survival? Economic incentives also played a role. Mercenaries prioritized pay over loyalty, while feudal troops might fight out of duty, honor, or fear of losing land or status. As you hear the murmur of troops preparing, you realize that loyalty was a complex tapestry of personal ties, political realities, and survival instincts. Remember those hired mercenaries with flamboyant armor. Their loyalty was often the most transactional of all. You dive into the tangled web of feudal obligations that shaped the size, composition, and readiness of the emperor's and prince's armies. For the emperor, military service was a complex obligation imposed on nobles throughout the empire, requiring them to provide troops for imperial campaigns, though enforcement was often uneven. The emperor's army relied heavily on these feudal levies, a patchwork of contributions varying by region and wealth. Princes' forces were similarly shaped by feudal ties, but on a smaller, more personal scale. Lords raised their own vassals and tenants, whose service was bound by local customs and contracts. The tight-knit nature of these relationships often resulted in more reliable and cohesive forces. Though their overall numbers were limited, a quirky detail: some nobles cleverly circumvented military service by paying scutage taxes, allowing them to fund mercenaries instead. A medieval loophole akin to paying someone else to do your homework. Historians still argue how effective feudal obligations were in sustaining long campaigns. While they guaranteed a pool of soldiers, levies often lacked training and discipline, and their service periods were short. Feudal ties also imposed social expectations and honor codes that could both motivate troops and complicate command structures. As lords balanced personal loyalty with military necessity, this system shaped not only army sizes, but also the social fabric of medieval warfare, intertwining war with land, family, and duty. Remember those varied recruitment methods. Feudal obligations were the backbone and sometimes the Achilles heel of medieval armies. You peer into the shadowy corners of the emperor's army and prince's forces to uncover their elite and specialized units, troops trained for unique roles beyond the regular foot soldiers and cavalry. The imperial army boasted engineers who constructed siege engines and fortifications. As well as crossbowmen renowned for their deadly precision, princes often fielded household guards, knights sworn personally to their lord, acting as shock troops and bodyguards. These specialized units brought vital skills, turning the tide in battles and sieges. Imagine engineers laboring to build towering trebuchets under enemy fire, or sharpshooting crossbowmen picking off officers from behind walls. A quirky tidbit: some elite mercenaries specialized in nocturnal raids and sabotage, earning nicknames like the Shadow Wolves for their stealth and ruthlessness, a medieval special forces before their time. Historians still debate the impact of these units, questioning whether their presence compensated for overall army weaknesses or merely added flavor to the medieval battlefield. Specialized troops required extra training, equipment, and coordination, often creating logistical challenges for commanders. Their loyalty sometimes lay with their trade or captains rather than their overlords. So, as you imagine these diverse units moving across the battlefield, you sense the complexity beneath the medieval warfare facade, a blend of brute force and nuanced expertise. Remember those colorful mercenaries. Many specialized troops were mercenaries with skills as sharp as their blades. You glance across the vast muster grounds, noting the sheer numbers each army could field, revealing the differing scales and limits that defined the emperor's and prince's forces. The emperor's army, drawing on a sprawling network of vassals, cities, and mercenaries, could theoretically mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers for large campaigns. However, practical constraints, logistics, politics, and time often limited actual force sizes. Princes, commanding smaller territories, raised more modest forces, sometimes just a few thousand men, but these were typically better coordinated and loyal. Their armies reflected the manageable scale of regional power and local governance. A quirky tidbit: some minor princes employed unique recruitment drives, including calling on town guilds or even religious fraternities to contribute troops. Imagine tailors and bakers wielding swords in defense of their prince. Historians still debate how size influenced battlefield outcomes. While larger imperial forces could overwhelm enemies, their cohesion was often weaker. Princes smaller, cohesive armies sometimes won through superior tactics and morale. The legal limits on military service, such as the emperor's 40-day campaign rule, constrained army sizes and campaign durations, shaping medieval warfare's rhythm. As you survey these armies arrayed under banners and flags, you realize numbers alone didn't guarantee victory. Organization, leadership, and loyalty often mattered more. Remember those colorful mercenaries? They sometimes tipped the balance in armies too small to dominate by sheer force. You feel the heavy weight of logistics pressing down on commanders as they plan supply lines and provisions for the emperor's army and the prince's forces, feeding thousands of hungry mouths, transporting weapons, armor, and fodder, and ensuring constant movement over rugged terrain were monumental tasks that could determine victory or defeat before battle even began. The emperor's vast army required complex supply chains stretching across the empire, relying on local resources, marchand caravans, and sometimes requisitioned goods. Disruptions could lead to starvation or desertion, turning the tide without a single sword stroke. Princess armies, smaller and more locally based, often had shorter supply lines but fewer resources, making them vulnerable to siege or blockade tactics. Their commanders relied heavily on regional knowledge to navigate terrain and secure provisions. A quirky fact, some supply convoys included entertainers and cooks who played crucial roles in maintaining morale, proving that a good meal and a song were as vital as arrows and armor. Historians still debate how medieval armies balanced the demands of mobility with the realities of supply. Some argue that logistical challenges limited campaign lengths and shaped warfare's seasonal rhythms. The use of river transport, pack animals, and primitive roads influenced routes and strategy. Commanders needed to protect supply lines from enemy raids and banditry. As you watch wagons creak over muddy roads and soldiers argue over rations, you realize logistics was the hidden backbone of medieval warfare, often invisible but always decisive. Remember those colorful mercenaries? They sometimes doubled as expert foragers and guards for supply trains. Adding their own unpredictable flair, you enter the tangled web where political control and military command intersect, revealing the tug-of-war between emperor, princes, and generals over authority. The emperor theoretically held supreme command over his armies, but in practice, political rivalries, regional interests, and personal ambitions complicated decision-making. Generals sometimes pursued their own agendas, balancing loyalty with personal gain. Princes exercised more direct control over their forces, commanding loyalty through personal bonds and territorial power. However, this local autonomy sometimes hindered broader strategic coordination, especially when princes acted independently or even against imperial interests. A quirky detail: some commanders used lavish gifts, feasts, or even subtle threats to maintain the loyalty of fractious nobles and mercenary captains, a medieval mix of diplomacy and coercion that kept armies intact. Historians still argue how centralized military control was in the empire, debating whether the emperor's authority was a unifying force or a ceremonial ideal undermined by practical realities. Power struggles often delayed campaigns, led to conflicting orders, or caused breakdowns in cooperation. At times, armies raised by princes fought each other or refused imperial commands. The balance of military and political power was a delicate dance, with success hinging on personalities as much as plans. As you hear the murmur of councils and the clash of ambitions, you grasp that medieval warfare was as much about politics as it was about swords. Remember those colorful mercenaries? Their loyalty often lay with paymasters rather than princes or emperors. Adding another layer to the command puzzle, you sense the delicate dance of cooperation and rivalry between the emperor and the princes, whose armies sometimes fought side by side and other times at odds. The emperor depended on princes to raise troops and resources, while princes sought to protect their autonomy and expand influence, creating a complex web of alliances, conflicts, and negotiations. Joint military campaigns were marked by uneasy truces, power struggles over command, and competing agendas. The emperor's need for unity clashed with the prince's desire for independence, leading to delays or fragmentation of forces. A quirky tidbit: at times, princes would stage lavish tournaments or feasts to curry favor with the emperor or each other before campaigns, turning warfare into a theatrical prelude of politics and showmanship. Historians still debate whether this balance between cooperation and rivalry strengthened the empire by preventing any one power from dominating or weakened it by fostering disunity. Occasionally, princes rebelled against the emperor, raising armies in open conflict, highlighting the fragile nature of imperial cohesion. As you watch banners mingle and commanders negotiate over maps, you realize medieval armies were as much political instruments as military machines. Remember those complex command structures? They reflected the tangled loyalties defining imperial and princely forces. You find yourself amid the thunder of hooves and clash of steel, witnessing a major imperial campaign orchestrated by the emperor himself, a sprawling endeavor to assert control or repel invaders. The army assembles from across the empire's patchwork lands, its soldiers carrying diverse armor, banners, and weapons that reflect their varied origins. The campaign is a logistical marvel, coordinating levies, mercenaries, and commanders with differing agendas. The emperor's generals strategize over maps strewn with tokens, balancing military objectives with political considerations. Supply lines stretch over long distances, while alliances are tested and reforged on the march. A quirky fact: some imperial armies employed large numbers of camp followers, families, merchants, cooks, creating mobile towns that both supported and sometimes hindered the army's progress. A medieval version of a traveling city, historians still argue the effectiveness of such campaigns, pointing to successes in consolidating imperial authority, but also failures caused by delays, disunity, and regional resistance. You feel the tension as commanders make choices that could alter the course of history, while soldiers brace for battles where fate often hinged on timing and cohesion. Remember those training grounds and logistical puzzles? They were all put to the test in these grand campaigns. You walk alongside the banners of a princely army embarking on an independent war, a conflict driven by regional ambition rather than imperial command. The prince's forces move swiftly, relying on local support and intimate knowledge of terrain. Their smaller, tightly knit army is a reflection of personal loyalty and territorial defense. The campaign is marked by bold maneuvers, rapid sieges, and calculated diplomacy. The prince commands with direct authority, coordinating knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries as extensions of his will. The army's movements are agile, exploiting weaknesses and local alliances. A quirky tidbit: some princes hired traveling minstrels to boost morale during marches and siege preparations. Blending culture with warfare, a reminder that medieval campaigns were not only brutal but often colorful. Historians still debate the strategic wisdom of these independent wars, weighing the benefits of localized control against the risks of fracturing imperial unity. You hear the clash of steel in quick raids, and the whispered negotiations with rival lords. Feeling the pulse of power concentrated in this regional struggle, remember those grand imperial campaigns. This is the smaller, sharper edge of medieval conflict, focused, personal, and sometimes more deadly. You find yourself surveying the varied terrains where these armies operated, from dense forests and winding rivers to vast plains and mountainous passes. The emperor's army, vast and cumbersome, sometimes struggled to maneuver through difficult landscapes. relying on engineers and scouts to forge paths and bridge obstacles. Princes, intimately familiar with their local geography, exploited terrain advantages, setting ambushes or defending narrow passes. Terrain-shaped tactics open fields favored the emperor's heavy cavalry charges, while forests and hills allowed princes to use guerrilla tactics and surprise attacks. Rivers could serve as defensive barriers or deadly traps. A quirky fact: some armies used clever camouflage, hiding archers and infantry in foliage, surprising enemies with sudden volleys. One campaign reportedly saw soldiers dressing in local farmers' clothes to blend in a medieval version of stealth tactics. Historians still debate how well commanders adapted to terrain challenges, with some praising local knowledge and others highlighting the limitations of large, diverse armies. Understanding the land was vital not just for battle but for supply routes and communication, influencing campaign success. As you move through these diverse landscapes, you grasp how nature itself was a silent, powerful player in medieval warfare. Remember those logistical struggles. They were often compounded by unforgiving terrain shaping every move. You listen to the faint echoes of bugles and horns, instruments of communication that bridged the chaos of medieval battlefields for the emperors and princes' armies. Orders were relayed through a network of runners, mounted messengers, signal flags, and musical calls, weaving a complex web of information amidst smoke and noise. The emperor's larger forces faced challenges coordinating disparate units spread across wide fronts, relying heavily on standardized signals and heralds. Princes' smaller armies benefited from closer proximity and direct command, but still grappled with delays and miscommunication. A quirky detail: some commanders employed trained pigeons or carrier dogs to send messages across lines. Early examples of battlefield communication, innovation. One tale recounts a pigeon delivering a crucial message just in time to prevent a disastrous charge. Historians still debate how effective these methods were, noting that misunderstandings could turn tactical maneuvers into chaos. The fog of war was as much about communication breakdown as enemy action. Commanders developed complex, pre-arranged signals for retreats, charges, and formations, but visibility and weather often hindered effectiveness. As you watch standards wave and horns sound, you sense the fragile thread by which order held in the whirlwind of battle. Remember those musical signals that sometimes caused confusion. They were a necessary gamble in the art of medieval war. You step into the dusty camps and muddy trenches, where the morale and daily experiences of soldiers in the emperor's and princes' armies come alive. Life for these medieval warriors was a mix of camaraderie, hardship, and relentless uncertainty. Soldiers endured hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence, yet forged bonds that turned strangers into brothers in arms. The emperor's vast armies often suffered from stretched supply lines and impersonal command, leading to uneven morale. Princes' forces, smaller and closer knit, enjoyed stronger group cohesion, but faced intense pressure to perform for their lord's honor. A quirky tidbit: some troops carried charms or amulets believed to protect against injury or bad luck. From carved bones to simple knots of cloth, early battlefield good luck tokens, historians still debate how morale affected medieval battles. High spirits could lead to heroic stands, while despair often caused roots or desertion. Soldiers' daily routines included drilling, guarding, repairing equipment, and sharing stories by campfires. Despite hardships, festivals and religious observances provided moments of relief. The ever-present danger forged a warrior culture where bravery and loyalty were prized, but survival often depended on pragmatism and adaptability. As you listen to whispered prayers and distant war cries, you sense the human heart beating beneath armor and banners. Remember those colorful mercenaries. Their reputation for ferocity was often matched by their camaraderie in camp. You watch as the relentless march of innovation reshapes the weapons, armor, and tactics of both the Emperor's army and the Prince's forces. Advances like the longbow, crossbow improvements, early firearms, and the gradual decline of heavy plate armor challenged the centuries-old dominance of armored knights. Commanders grappled with integrating new technologies while preserving tried-and-true methods. The Emperor's larger forces often had better access to cutting-edge weaponry and engineers. Experimenting with gunpowder weapons and artillery, Prince's armies, though smaller, quickly adopted innovations to offset numerical disadvantages, sometimes becoming early pioneers in specialized troop types or new tactics. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers mounted small cannons on carts, known as ribaldequins, earning nicknames like organ guns due to the rapid volley of shots. Imagine medieval rock concerts with cannon fire. Historians still debate how rapidly these technological changes altered medieval warfare. Some argue new weapons rendered traditional knightly combat obsolete, while others see a gradual evolution with knights adapting over time. Changes in armor design reflected these threats. Balancing protection with mobility, the rise of pike formations and infantry-centric tactics shifted battle dynamics. These innovations demanded new training, logistics, and command approaches, testing armies' adaptability. As you hear the roar of early artillery and the crack of crossbows, you glimpse a turning point where old worlds give way to new. Remember those colorful mercenaries. Their adaptability often put them ahead in adopting novel arms and tactics. You settle into the scholarly debates swirling around the effectiveness of the Emperor's army versus the Prince's forces, a contest not just of swords, but of strategy, politics, and logistics. Some historians champion the Emperor's army for its potential scale and symbolic unity, citing successful campaigns that expanded or defended imperial power. Others highlight its weaknesses: fragmented command, inconsistent troop quality, and political infighting that undermined cohesion. Prince's armies receive praise for their tighter organization, loyalty, and adaptability, often winning battles against larger imperial forces through superior tactics and local knowledge. Yet critics argue their limited numbers and resources made them vulnerable to overwhelming opposition. A quirky, scholarly argument involves whether the presence of colorful mercenaries enhanced or detracted from army effectiveness. While their skills were undeniable, mercenaries' unpredictable loyalties sometimes sowed discord. These debates reflect broader questions about medieval warfare's nature. Was brute force or strategy more decisive? Did political fragmentation weaken or strengthen military outcomes? As you engage with these ongoing discussions, you realize history is less about absolutes and more about complex, competing perspectives. Remember those logistical nightmares and command intrigues. They're central to understanding these armies' successes and failures. You enter the cultural heart of the empire and its regions, where identity, tradition, and social structures shaped not only who fought, but how they fought. The Emperor's army was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and customs, reflecting the diverse peoples of the empire from Germanic tribes to Italian city-states, each bringing unique military traditions and social expectations. Prince's forces, more localized, were deeply rooted in regional identities, customs, and loyalties. Their troops often shared language, religion, and culture, fostering cohesion and shared purpose. A quirky detail: Some units in the emperor's army preserved ancient rituals, war dances, chants, unique armor styles reflecting long-standing cultural heritage. One group famously wore brightly colored sashes and performed a war cry that sounded like a yodel. Historians still debate how much cultural diversity affected military effectiveness. Some argue it enriched strategies and resilience. Others see it as a source of friction and misunderstanding. Religious practices also influenced armies, with patron saints, rituals before battle, and blessings seen as vital to morale and success. As you listen to war cries mingled with local songs and prayers, you sense that medieval armies were living tapestries of culture and identity. As much as instruments of war, remember those colorful mercenaries, their eclectic origins added to this rich cultural mosaic. You trace the fading footsteps of these medieval forces as they evolve into the early modern militaries that would shape Europe's future. The emperor's army and prince's forces gradually gave way to standing armies professionally trained, centrally funded, and increasingly uniform. The rise of gunpowder, improved logistics, and centralized states made feudal levies and mercenaries less viable. The transformation was uneven and contested. Some noble families adapted, entering new military and administrative roles, while others saw their traditional powers diminished. Castles became residences rather than fortresses. Knights evolved into officers or ceremonial figures. A quirky tidbit: some former knights turned to fencing schools or military academies, passing down martial skills in more formalized settings, laying groundwork for modern military science. Historians still debate the pace and impact of this transition. Was it a sudden revolution or a gradual evolution? Either way, the medieval army's legacy shaped European warfare and statecraft. As you watch banners lower and steel give way to muskets, you feel the end of an era, but also the birth of new forms of power. Remember those grand imperial campaigns and princely wars. Their echoes resonate in the modern battlefield's complex choreography. You stand at the crossroads of power, politics, and warfare, reflecting on the vast contrasts and subtle overlaps between the emperor's army and the prince's forces. Both shaped medieval Europe's destiny, embodying different visions of authority, centralized imperial reach versus regional autonomy. Their armies were mirrors of political structures, social bonds, and evolving military art. The emperor's army represented unity and aspiration, a symbol of an empire struggling to maintain cohesion across diverse lands. The prince's forces embodied local strength, personal loyalty, and the realities of feudal fragmentation. A quirky final note: despite rivalry, soldiers from both armies sometimes found common cause, sharing tactics, equipment, and even fighting side by side when greater threats loomed. A medieval, all for one moment. Historians still debate which was more effective or influential, but it's clear both were indispensable in their contexts, each with strengths and flaws. As you watch banners flutter and soldiers march toward uncertain futures, you feel the enduring legacy of these armies, their stories etched into history's fabric. Remember those musical signals, colorful mercenaries, and political intrigues, their threads woven through this grand tapestry of medieval war.